When a good empath is betrayed, the deepest wound is not always the betrayal itself. It is the collapse of a belief system. A good empath tends to move through relationships with a certain assumption that if I am honest with you, patient with you, loyal to you, and willing to understand you, you will eventually meet me at that same level. That assumption feels reasonable because the empath is using their own internal world as the reference point. They know what loyalty means to them, so they naturally expect some version of it from others. And this is where betrayal becomes psychologically devastating, because betrayal forces the empath to confront a reality they may have avoided for years. Understanding someone does not mean that person will understand you. Seeing someone's wounds does not make them incapable of hurting you. Knowing why someone behaves badly does not obligate you to remain available for the consequences of that behavior. That distinction is enormous. Empaths are often exceptionally good at explaining other people's behavior. They can look at anger and see insecurity. They can look at withdrawal and recognize fear. They can look at manipulation and understand where it may have originated. But there is a danger in becoming so skilled at understanding someone's pain that you accidentally use their pain as an excuse for their behavior. You begin saying, they didn't mean it. Then they're just going through something. Then they've been hurt before. And eventually, without realizing it, you are building an entire psychological defense system around someone who is hurting you. The betrayal breaks that system. Suddenly, the empath begins reviewing the past. Conversations that once seemed harmless start looking different. Small inconsistencies become obvious. Moments they dismissed suddenly become evidence of a larger pattern. And one of the most painful questions appears, how did I not see this? But that question needs to be handled carefully, because the empath's mistake was not necessarily being stupid. It was often being generous with interpretation. They saw potential where another person was showing patterns. They listened to explanations when they should have been watching behavior. They focused on what someone could become instead of what that person consistently demonstrated. And betrayal teaches a brutal psychological lesson. Intentions are invisible, but patterns are observable. You cannot directly see what someone thinks. You cannot reliably measure what they feel simply because they tell you, but you can observe what they repeatedly do. You can observe how they behave when they are angry, when they don't get what they want, when you establish a boundary, when they have nothing to gain, and when they believe there will be no consequences. Those moments reveal character. This is where a good empath begins changing. They don't necessarily become cruel. They don't stop caring. They don't suddenly lose their capacity for compassion. Instead, their compassion becomes informed by reality. Before betrayal, the empath may ask, why would someone do this to me? After betrayal, they begin asking a more powerful question, what does this person's behavior tell me about who they are? That shift changes everything, because the first question keeps you psychologically attached to an explanation. The second question moves you toward observation, and observation creates distance. This is not emotional coldness. It is emotional clarity. A mature empath eventually realizes that forgiveness and access are not the same thing. You can understand someone's history and still refuse to participate in their dysfunction. You can forgive someone internally and still decide that they no longer belong in your inner circle. You can wish someone well and still walk away. That is not hatred. That is discernment. And perhaps the hardest part is accepting that sometimes you will never receive the explanation you wanted. The person who betrayed you may never fully understand what they did. They may minimize it, justify it, blame you for it, or rewrite the story entirely. If your healing depends on their confession, you have handed them control over your recovery. A good empath has to learn something much deeper. Closure does not always come from the person who caused the wound. Sometimes closure comes from finally believing what their behavior already told you. And this is the point where betrayal can become transformational. The empath stops asking, how can I make them understand my heart? And begins asking, why did I give someone access to my heart without requiring evidence that they could protect it? That question is uncomfortable, but it is empowering, because once you understand that trust should be earned through consistency rather than granted through words, You become much harder to manipulate. You stop confusing chemistry with character. You stop confusing apologies with transformation. You stop confusing someone's potential with their actual behavior. And you begin to understand that being a good person does not mean being endlessly available. Your empathy is a gift, but it is not a contract that requires you to tolerate betrayal. The lesson is simple. Never let your ability to understand someone become the reason you abandon yourself. And once that realization settles in, something else begins to happen. The empath becomes quieter. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they finally understand that explaining yourself repeatedly does not create understanding in someone who has already decided not to understand you. This is one of the most important psychological shifts that happens after betrayal. Before the experience, the empath may believe that if they can just explain their feelings clearly enough, provide enough context, show enough patience, or reveal enough vulnerability, the other person will eventually recognize the damage they have caused. So they explain, they send the long message, they revisit the conversation, they clarify what they meant, they give another opportunity, then another. They try to remove every possible misunderstanding. But eventually something becomes obvious. Communication cannot solve a problem that behavior keeps recreating. And that is when observation replaces explanation. The empath begins watching. They watch what happens when they say no. They watch whether apologies are followed by changed behavior. They notice whether someone's kindness disappears when they no longer need something. They pay attention to how a person treats them when there is nothing to gain. And this is a major development in emotional intelligence because human beings often reveal themselves most clearly through patterns rather than isolated events. Anybody can have a bad day. Anybody can make a mistake. Anybody can say the wrong thing. But patterns are different. A pattern tells you what repeatedly happens when circumstances trigger the same underlying tendencies. If someone continually disrespects your boundaries and then apologizes only after consequences appear, the apology may be less important than the repetition. If someone repeatedly creates emotional chaos and then positions themselves as the victim, the story matters less than the pattern. The empath begins understanding this distinction. They stop asking, "What did this person say?" and start asking, "What does this person consistently do?" That question is powerful because words create possibilities while behavior creates evidence. This does not mean becoming cynical. It means becoming precise. Cynicism says nobody can be trusted. Discernment says trust should correspond to evidence. Those are completely different psychological positions. The betrayed empath doesn't necessarily lose their faith in people, they lose their willingness to ignore information, and that is a profound difference. You may notice that they become less reactive during conflict. They don't immediately defend themselves, they don't rush to convince someone that they are a good person. They don't feel the same urgency to correct every false accusation. Why? Because they have discovered something about human psychology. When someone is committed to misunderstanding you, more information does not necessarily produce clarity. Sometimes it simply gives them more material to reinterpret, so the empath learns to conserve their energy. They realize that every explanation has a cost. Every argument requires emotional investment. Every attempt to prove your innocence keeps you psychologically connected to the person judging you. Every desperate attempt to be understood can quietly reinforce the belief that their approval determines your worth. And eventually, the empath says, "I don't need to convince you." That sentence represents an enormous internal shift. It means your identity no longer depends on another person's interpretation of you. Think about how much power that gives you. If someone misunderstands you, you can correct them once. If they refuse to hear you, you can step back. If someone repeatedly violates your boundaries, you don't need a courtroom presentation explaining why your boundary is reasonable. A boundary is not a debate. It is information about what you will and will not participate in. And this is where silence becomes powerful. Silence is not always punishment. Sometimes silence is simply the absence of unnecessary participation. The mature empath doesn't withdraw to make someone panic. They don't disappear hoping the other person will chase them. They don't use distance as a manipulation tactic. They step back because they have learned that peace is more valuable than winning an argument. That is a completely different form of strength. And interestingly, when you stop explaining everything, you begin hearing more. You hear the pauses, you notice contradictions. You recognize emotional pressure. You see how quickly someone changes their personality depending on who is watching. You observe whether their behavior matches their words. In other words, silence creates psychological space, and psychological space allows perception. This is why betrayal can eventually sharpen an empath's awareness. The person who once absorbed every emotion around them begins separating what belongs to them from what belongs to someone else. They no longer feel responsible for regulating everyone's emotional state. Someone else's anger does not automatically become their emergency. Someone else's disappointment does not automatically become their obligation. Someone else's misunderstanding does not automatically become their problem to solve. That is freedom. And perhaps the most powerful part of this transformation is that the empath does not need to become less sensitive. They simply become more selective about where their sensitivity goes. They still care, they still notice, they still feel deeply, but now they observe before they invest. They listen before they trust. They watch patterns before they make promises. And that is what betrayal can teach when the lesson is fully understood. You don't have to stop feeling deeply. You simply have to stop ignoring what you see. And once the empath learns to observe instead of constantly explain, another transformation begins. Their compassion develops boundaries. This is where many people misunderstand what healing actually looks like. They assume that if you were once deeply compassionate, you should remain endlessly compassionate no matter how someone treats you. But compassion without boundaries can become self-abandonment. And self-abandonment is not love. It is the gradual disappearance of your own needs beneath the needs of everyone around you. A good empath often has an extraordinary ability to see the humanity behind someone's behavior. They can recognize the wounded child behind the angry adult. They can understand insecurity behind arrogance, fear behind withdrawal, and pain behind defensiveness. That ability is valuable. But there is a line between understanding behavior and accepting behavior. You can understand why someone became manipulative without allowing them to manipulate you. You can understand why someone is emotionally unavailable without waiting indefinitely for them to become available. You can understand someone's trauma without volunteering to become the place where that trauma gets repeatedly discharged. That distinction is the beginning of emotional maturity, because empathy answers the question, why might this person be behaving this way? Boundaries answer a different question. Regardless of why they behave this way, what am I willing to accept? Those questions should never be confused. The empath who has been betrayed eventually realizes that someone's pain does not automatically create an obligation for you to absorb it. Your ability to understand another person's suffering does not mean you must sacrifice your own psychological stability to prove that you care. And this can feel uncomfortable at first. Why? Because many empaths have trained themselves to associate being needed with being valuable. They become the listener, the rescuer, the mediator, the person everyone calls when everything falls apart. And there can be a strange psychological reward in that role. When people need you, you feel significant. When you solve their problems, you feel useful. When you calm their chaos, you feel connected. But eventually, you have to ask a difficult question. What happens to me when nobody is asking what I need? That question exposes the hidden cost of excessive compassion. Because if your relationships are built entirely around what you provide, you may eventually discover that people know how to access your energy, but never learned how to protect it. And betrayal makes that impossible to ignore. The empath begins recognizing the difference between reciprocity and dependency. A reciprocal relationship allows both people to give and receive. A dependent relationship may continuously consume one person's emotional resources while calling that consumption love. Once the empath sees this, they begin changing their behavior. They stop answering every message immediately. They stop fixing every conflict. They stop taking responsibility for emotions that belong to other people. They stop apologizing simply because someone else is upset. And perhaps most importantly, they stop feeling guilty for having limits. That guilt is significant because guilt often appears when you violate an old identity. If you have spent years being the person who always says yes, saying no can feel like becoming selfish, even when the no is completely reasonable. But discomfort is not evidence that your boundary is wrong. Sometimes discomfort is simply evidence that you are doing something unfamiliar. Think about a person who has spent years giving away pieces of themselves to maintain peace. The first time they protect their time, their attention, their privacy, or their emotional energy, they may feel selfish. But consider the alternative. What happens when you repeatedly say yes while your entire nervous system is saying no? Resentment, exhaustion, emotional numbness. Eventually, even genuine kindness begins to feel like a burden because you are giving from an empty place. That is why boundaries actually protect compassion. When you know you can say no, your yes becomes more meaningful. When you know you can walk away, your decision to stay becomes a choice rather than a fear response. When you understand that access to you is earned through consistent behavior, you no longer have to hate people to create distance from them. You simply become selective. And selectivity is not cruelty. A garden does not hate the weeds because it removes them. It simply understands that not everything can be allowed to grow in the same space. Your emotional life works the same way. Not everyone deserves the same access to your attention. Not everyone deserves the same level of trust. Not everyone deserves unlimited opportunities to hurt you. And this is where the betrayed empath becomes especially powerful. They don't necessarily become harder. They become clearer. They can still forgive. They can still love. They can still recognize someone's humanity, but they no longer confuse forgiveness with permission. They no longer confuse compassion with tolerance. They no longer confuse loyalty with remaining in situations that repeatedly destroy their peace. This is not the death of empathy. It is the evolution of empathy. The empath finally understands that protecting yourself does not make you less loving. It makes your love more conscious. So if you have spent your life believing that being a good person means endlessly giving, remember this: your compassion is a gift, but your boundaries decide who is allowed to receive it. And once the empath begins protecting their compassion with boundaries, something very interesting often happens. They become quieter, more private, and more selective about where they place their energy. From the outside, this can look like isolation. But internally, something much more important may be happening. They are rebuilding. After betrayal, the mind naturally searches for meaning. It reviews conversations, replays moments, examines decisions, and asks questions that may not have easy answers. What did I miss? Why did I trust them? Why did I stay? Why did I keep giving chances? Why didn't I listen to myself? That mental process can be exhausting, but it can also become the beginning of self-awareness. The problem is that many people try to escape this period too quickly. They rush into another relationship, another friendship, another distraction, another source of validation. They want the pain gone before they have understood what created it. But healing rarely works that way. Sometimes you need psychological distance before you can see the situation clearly. Think about what happens when you stand too close to a painting. You see individual details, but you cannot see the whole image. Step back, and suddenly the pattern becomes visible. Betrayal can be like that. When you are emotionally entangled with someone, your perception is influenced by hope, attachment, fear, memories, and expectations. You are not simply observing their behavior. You are interpreting it through everything you wish the relationship could become. Distance changes the equation. When the emotional noise decreases, the empath can finally hear their own thoughts. And this is why solitude, when chosen consciously, can become restorative. There is a major difference between isolation and solitude. Isolation says, I don't need anyone because people cannot be trusted. Solitude says, I need enough space to hear myself again. The first is often a defense. The second can be a form of recovery. A betrayed empath may spend less time explaining themselves and more time reflecting. They may become less interested in proving their worth and more interested in understanding their values. They start asking questions that are deeper than, who hurt me? They ask, why did I tolerate what I tolerated? What did I believe I had to earn? Why did I ignore my discomfort? What kind of relationship actually reflects the person I am becoming? These questions shift the focus from the betrayer to the self. And that is critical, because if your entire healing process revolves around the person who hurt you, they remain psychologically present long after they are physically gone. You replay what they said, you imagine what you should have said, you wonder whether they regret it, you check whether they have changed, you imagine them finally understanding your value. But notice what all of those thoughts have in common. They keep your attention outside yourself. True rebuilding begins when you reclaim that attention. You stop asking what they are thinking and start asking what you are building. You stop monitoring their life and start examining your own. You stop waiting for them to recognize your value and begin acting as though your value was never theirs to determine. That is a profound psychological shift, and it often requires periods of quiet. During that quiet, the empath may rediscover things they abandoned while trying to maintain the relationship, their ambitions, their creativity, their routines, their friendships, their curiosity, their physical environment, their sense of humor, their ability to enjoy a day without constantly wondering how someone else feels about them. They begin discovering that peace can feel unfamiliar after prolonged emotional chaos. And that is important because people sometimes mistake peace for emptiness. If you have been accustomed to emotional highs and lows, constant communication, unpredictable affection, conflict followed by reconciliation, and repeated uncertainty, a calm life can initially feel strangely boring. But boredom is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is your nervous system finally experiencing the absence of chaos. And as that happens, the empath begins developing something betrayal could not take away: self-trust. Self-trust means believing yourself when something feels wrong. It means respecting your observations. It means listening to discomfort before it becomes devastation. It means knowing that you can survive disappointment without abandoning yourself. And perhaps most importantly, self-trust means you no longer require another person to validate your perception of reality. You don't need them to admit they manipulated you before you can acknowledge that you felt manipulated. You don't need them to apologize before you can establish a boundary. You don't need them to agree with your decision before you can make it. That is emotional independence. And emotional independence does not mean you stop loving people. It means love no longer requires you to lose yourself. So if betrayal has made you quieter, don't automatically assume something is wrong with you. Maybe you are learning to listen. Maybe you are discovering which relationships nourish you and which ones drain you. Maybe you are rebuilding a version of yourself that existed before you started negotiating your worth for someone else's approval. Use the silence, use the distance, use the solitude. Not to become bitter, but to become clear. Because sometimes the strongest version of you is not created in the moment you fight back. It is created in the quiet moment when you finally decide to rebuild yourself without asking anyone for permission. Step away from the noise, rebuild your inner world, and never confuse your solitude with weakness. And after all of this, the observation, the boundaries, the solitude, the rebuilding, something changes at the deepest level. The empath becomes harder to manipulate. Not because they become suspicious of everyone, not because they stop loving, and certainly not because betrayal turns them into the very kind of person who hurt them. They become harder to manipulate because they finally understand themselves. That distinction matters. Manipulation becomes powerful when someone can control your emotional reactions. If they can make you feel guilty, you can be controlled through guilt. If they can make you afraid of abandonment, they can control you through distance. If they can make you desperate for approval, they can control you through validation. But when you understand your own emotional triggers, those mechanisms begin losing their power. This is one of the most important lessons a betrayed empath can learn. Your sensitivity is not necessarily the weakness. Your lack of awareness about how your sensitivity is being used is the vulnerability. Once you recognize that, everything changes. For example, imagine someone repeatedly crosses a boundary and then becomes emotional when you confront them. The old version of you might immediately shift attention away from the behavior and toward their feelings. Maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe they're hurting. Maybe I should give them another chance. But the more emotionally mature version of you can pause and ask a different question. Why did their reaction make me question a boundary that was reasonable in the first place? That pause is power, because manipulation often depends on speed. Someone creates emotional pressure, and you react before you think. Someone becomes angry, and you immediately apologize. Someone withdraws affection, and you chase. Someone accuses you of being selfish, and you start proving that you're not. But when you learn to pause, you interrupt the cycle. You create space between stimulus and response, and inside that space is choice. That is where emotional freedom begins. The betrayed empath also becomes more attentive to inconsistency. They notice when someone's words and behavior don't match. They notice when affection appears only when they are useful. They notice when apologies arrive without behavioral change. They notice when someone respects boundaries only when there is a consequence. They notice when a person repeatedly creates conflict and then positions themselves as the victim. None of these observations require paranoia. They require attention. And there is an important philosophical principle here. You should judge character less by what someone promises and more by what they repeatedly practice. People can say anything about who they are. Consistency is harder to fake. Anyone can say, I respect you, but do they respect your no? Anyone can say, I care about you too, but do they care about your well-being when caring requires sacrifice? Anyone can say, I'm sorry. But what changes afterward? The empath who has learned from betrayal stops treating words as conclusions. Words become data. Behavior becomes evidence. Patterns become the basis for trust. And this dramatically changes relationships. You no longer give someone unlimited access because they made you feel understood during one conversation. You don't confuse intense chemistry with emotional safety. You don't interpret someone's vulnerability as proof of their character. You don't assume that because someone tells you their deepest wounds, they automatically have the emotional maturity to avoid wounding you. That is a difficult lesson. Someone can know exactly what pain feels like and still cause pain. Someone can understand trauma and still behave destructively. Someone can love you and still be incapable of loving you in a healthy way. Those realities can exist simultaneously. And once the empath accepts that, they stop trying to make every relationship work. They understand that compatibility is not simply about how strongly two people feel, it is also about how safely two people behave. This is where discernment becomes more valuable than intensity. The empath begins choosing consistency over excitement, peace over emotional chaos, reciprocity over potential, character over charm, and that is not becoming cold, that is becoming selective. There is another powerful transformation that happens here. The empath stops needing revenge. This may sound simple, but psychologically, it is enormous. Revenge keeps you connected to the person who hurt you. You are still organizing your behavior around them. You want them to regret it. You want them to see what they lost. You want them to feel the pain they caused. But freedom begins when their reaction no longer matters. You don't need them to suffer for your healing to be legitimate. You don't need them to come back for your worth to be restored. You don't need them to admit they were wrong before you are allowed to move forward. Your life becomes the answer. And perhaps this is the most powerful outcome of betrayal. The empath does not become less loving. They become more conscious about where their love goes. They don't stop seeing people's wounds. They simply stop allowing those wounds to dictate their boundaries. They don't stop believing in people. They simply require evidence before granting deep trust. They don't become heartless. They become self-respecting. And that is the final transformation. Because the strongest empath is not the person who can tolerate the most pain. It is the person who can remain compassionate without repeatedly volunteering for it. So if betrayal has changed you, don't ask only, how do I become the person I was before? Ask something better. Who can I become now that I finally know what I know? Let that question guide you, because the goal is not to build a harder heart. The goal is to build a wiser one.